A 70-year-old man retires with $500,000. He did everything right. He saved for 40 years, he lived modestly, he has his nest egg. His financial advisor tells him to take 4% out per year. That's $20,000. He can live on that, plus Social Security. He'll be fine. 23 years later, he's dead. His family inherits $1.5 million. He wasn't trying to get rich, he was trying to not run out of money, but the system had other plans for his capital. And that gap between what he took out and what remained is where the real mechanics of retirement actually hide. This isn't luck, this isn't secret knowledge, this is how compound growth works when time is still on your side, even when you think it isn't. Here's the thing most people don't realize about retirement. It's not a fixed destination. It's not a date where you stop working and your money sits in a hole until you die. Retirement is actually an investment strategy wearing a different name. Right now, about 40 million Americans are retired or about to be, and most of them are sitting on more capital than they've ever had in their lives. But their financial plans are built on scarcity, on fear of running out, on the idea that they need to preserve, not grow. So they do what their advisors tell them. They take 4% per year, they move their money into safe assets, they try to make it last. And accidentally, they become rich. The math that makes this happen isn't complicated, but it is invisible, because it requires you to think about time and growth in a way that doesn't match the emotional experience of being retired. Here's the setup. Let's take someone real, Sarah. She retires at 65 with exactly $500,000. She takes 4% out annually, that's $20,000 the first year. Her advisor puts the rest in a diversified portfolio. 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Pretty standard. She's nervous about the market. She's heard too many stories about people losing everything. But she doesn't touch the allocation. She just takes her $20,000 and lives her life. Now here's where most people's thinking stops. They imagine her money slowly depleting. Year by year, the pot gets smaller. Eventually, it runs out. But that's not what happens. Let's actually walk through the math. Year 1. She starts with $500,000. The market returns 8% that year. That's $40,000 in growth. She takes out $20,000 to live on. Net result, her account grows to $520,000. Most people stop calculating here. They think, okay, the market went up, she took out money, net, it's a wash. But she did net positive. The money in her account actually grew. Year 2. Now she's starting with $526,000. The market returns 5% that year. That's $26,000 in growth. She takes out $20,000. Her account is now $526,000. Year 3, market up 8% again. Year 4, down 2%. Year 5, up 12%. The sequence of returns isn't linear. Some years she gains more than she takes. Some years she loses ground. But here's the critical part. She's taking out a fixed dollar amount, $20,000, while her portfolio is potentially returning much more. If the market goes up 8% and she only takes 4% out, she's compounding on the difference. She's letting the growth run ahead of her withdrawal rate. This is the fundamental mechanism, and it sounds simple until you realize what it implies. Over 23 years, she takes out approximately $460,000, but her portfolio, despite those withdrawals, grew from $500,000 to $1.5 million. She withdrew almost $1 million less than what she was left with. How is this possible? Because she never adjusted her withdrawals for inflation or for market growth. She took out the same nominal amount every year, while her portfolio potentially tripled. Let's zoom into the math more carefully. The average stock market return since 1926 is about 10% nominally, but it's variable. Some years it's 20%, some years it's negative, some years it's 3%. If you assume a 9% average return on a diversified portfolio minus inflation of about 3%, you're getting a real return of about 6% per year after inflation. She's withdrawing 4% per year, 6% minus 4% means the portfolio is net growing at about 2% per year in real terms, even accounting for inflation. 2% might not sound like much, but applied to $500,000 compounded over 2 decades, it's the difference between $500,000 and $1.5 million. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The financial advice she followed was designed to make her feel safe, not to optimize her outcomes. The 4% rule didn't come from trying to maximize wealth. It came from a study in the 90s that asked, what's the maximum you can safely withdraw from a portfolio without going broke in a 30-year retirement, even during a severe market downturn? The answer was 4%, so that became the standard. Retirees were told, take 4% out and you'll be fine. But fine and getting wealthy are different things, and the advice was so conservative, so focused on preventing ruin, that it accidentally created situations where people are compounding wealth at a rate that vastly exceeds their lifestyle needs. Sarah didn't get rich because she was a brilliant investor. She got rich because she was a mediocre one who didn't touch her allocation and waited. But here's the absurdity. If she'd actually believed she was going to get rich, she might have spent more. She might have taken 6% instead of 4%, figuring she had room, and she probably would have ended up leaving money behind anyway. The system requires her fear to function. It requires her to believe she might run out of money even when the math suggests she almost certainly won't. Now, not every retiree with $500,000 ends up with $1.5 million. The math changes based on when you retire. If Sarah had retired in 2007 and the market crashed immediately, her first few years would have been brutal. Sequence of returns risk is real. Take money out of a falling portfolio and your compounding power is damaged. But over long time frames, with a reasonable allocation and patience, the default outcome for someone who follows conservative advice is actually being more wealthy than they planned. So why don't all retirees end up wealthy? Some do adjust their withdrawals. When the market is up 20% in a year, they think, I'm doing great, let me take a bit more. So they bump their withdrawal to 5% or 6%. Now their money compounds slower, or not at all. Some have health crises. They need assisted living. They have a surgery. Their $500,000 becomes $200,000 in 2 years. The math breaks. Some panic. In 2008, when the market dropped 40%, some retirees sold everything. They went to cash right at the bottom. They locked in their losses. They missed the recovery. Their $500,000 became $250,000 and never fully recovered. And some, frankly, just don't live long enough. They die at 75 instead of 88. Their heirs get the windfall, not them. They never experience the wealth accumulation they'd earned. But for people who retire with a decent nest egg, don't panic, don't get sick, and live a reasonably long life, the math almost guarantees they end up with more money than they started. This creates a strange situation in retirement planning. The goal isn't to spend down your assets carefully. The goal is to take out just enough to live on while positioning your portfolio to grow. Which is the exact opposite of how most people think about retirement. They think, I have a pot of money. I need to make it last. The math says you have a growing asset. You need to extract income from it without disrupting the growth. There are some dark implications hidden in this mechanics. First, wealth compounds for the already wealthy. Sarah didn't retire with $500,000 because she was lucky or brilliant. She retired with $500,000 because she had a stable job for 40 years and lived below her means. She did the boring thing. And that boring thing, combined with time and market returns, made her genuinely wealthy by the end of her life. But for retirees who saved only $200,000 because they had lower income, the same math applies. They grow their portfolio through compound returns. But $200,000 compounding to $600,000 still leaves them with much less money than Sarah. The gap widens. Time helps everyone, but it helps the people who started with more. Second, there's an incentive structure issue. Financial advisors are often paid a percentage of assets under management, so they have an incentive to make your portfolio last as long as possible, and ideally, grow. The 4% rule serves them perfectly. It keeps money in their management, it's conservative enough that retirees don't panic and pull their money out, and it's positioned as a rule of thumb, not financial advice, so advisors aren't liable if it works too well. Third, and most importantly, this mechanism explains why wealthy people tend to stay wealthy and why it's hard to catch up once you're behind. If you have $1 million and you're retired and you take 4% a year, you're living on $40,000 annually while your million compounds. You're probably actually growing richer.
If you have $100,000 and take 4%, you're living on $4,000 annually, probably not sustainable without Social Security. You might need to take 6, 7, 8%. Now your compounding breaks. You might actually deplete your capital. The rule works in abundance. It breaks in scarcity. Here's what this actually means. Retirement isn't the end of your financial life. It's the beginning of a compound growth phase where your behaviors matter less than they ever have before. Because you're not generating income from work anymore, your returns come from markets and from the gap between what you withdraw and what you earn. The person who retired with $500,000 and takes 4% probably dies wealthy by accident. They were trying to preserve. Instead, they compounded. The person who retired with $1 million and takes 1% on purpose, reinvesting the rest, might actually be building generational wealth without trying. But the person who retires with $50,000 and has to take it all out just to survive, they're in a different math entirely. Time doesn't help them. Compound growth is irrelevant when you're in deficit spending. So retirement isn't really about having enough money. It's about having enough money to get into the zone where compound growth is positive. Once you're in that zone, time does most of the work. Which means the real financial stress happens before retirement, not after. It's about getting to that $500,000 threshold while you're still working. After that, if you're disciplined, the system almost guarantees you'll end up better off than you planned. So here's what this leaves you with. If compound growth in retirement is almost inevitable for people with adequate capital, why isn't everyone talking about this? Why are retirees obsessing over sequence of returns risk and safe withdrawal rates instead of just understanding that they're probably going to end up with more than they need? Is it that advisors benefit from their anxiety? Is it that talking about wealth accumulation and retirement feels unseemly, like you're being greedy? Is it that we're psychologically structured to worry about scarcity even when the math says abundance? Or is it that most people will never have the $500,000 in the first place, and talking about what happens after you have it is just cruel? The answer probably isn't simple, but the math is. And if you have enough to be Sarah, the math is on your side, whether you know it or not. Thank you so much, legends, for watching this video.